March 24, 1945. The banks of the Rhine River. Nazi high command is in a panic. Their reconnaissance planes have just spotted something terrifying. Down in the valley, the Americans are massing. It's not just a battalion, it's a monster. Hundreds of Sherman tanks are lined up in attack formation. Artillery batteries are dug in. Thousands of troops are moving through the trees. The radio waves are buzzing with the chaotic noise of a massive invasion force preparing to strike. The Germans don't hesitate. They scramble their panzer divisions. They redirect their heavy artillery. They pour thousands of rounds of high-explosive shells onto the American position to stop the breakthrough before it starts. The shells scream through the air. They slam into the American tanks. The earth explodes. But then, something impossible happens. The tank didn't explode. It popped. There was no armor. There was no engine. There were no soldiers. The Germans had just fired $1 million worth of ammunition at a balloon. This was not a battlefield. This was a stage. And the men down there weren't soldiers. They were painters. They were fashion designers. They were sound engineers. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. But history would know them by a different name: the Ghost Army. War is usually simple. You find the enemy, you shoot the enemy, you destroy the enemy. But in 1944, the United States Army realized that brute force wasn't enough. Hitler's Fortress Europe was too strong. To win, the Allies didn't just need more guns, they needed to lie. They needed a lie so big, so detailed, and so convincing that it would break the back of the Third Reich. For 50 years, this story was classified. The men who served in this unit were told that if they spoke a word of what they did, they would face court-martial. Even their wives didn't know. They told their families they blew up bridges. They told them they fixed radios. But the truth was much stranger. These men were armed with 500-pound speakers, inflatable rubber tanks, and paintbrushes. Their mission was not to fight the enemy. Their mission was to be the target. Imagine standing in an open field, holding a rubber tank, waiting for a real German Tiger tank to shoot at you. That wasn't just their job. That was their art form. And this is how they pulled off the greatest magic trick in military history. To understand the Ghost Army, you have to understand that it shouldn't have existed. The U.S. Army is a machine of order. It loves straight lines, clean uniforms, and following rules. But in 1943, a recruitment drive began that broke every rule in the book. The Army wasn't looking for sharpshooters. They were scouring the art schools of New York and Philadelphia. They went to the Pratt Institute. They went to Cooper Union. They went to the Cleveland School of Art. They were looking for a very specific type of mind, a mind that understood perspective, shadow, color, and drama. Enter Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll. These weren't your typical officers. Ingersoll was a journalist, a civilian at heart who understood the power of a story. They proposed a radical idea. What if we built a unit dedicated entirely to tactical deception? Not just spies whispering in bars. A mobile tactical unit that could impersonate a 30,000-man infantry division. They gathered 1,000 men. It was the strangest collection of talent ever assembled under one flag. You had Bill Blass, who would go on to become a world-famous fashion designer. You had Ellsworth Kelly, the future giant of minimalism. You had Arthur Singer, who would become one of America's greatest wildlife artists. Instead of rifle practice, these soldiers spent their days arguing about the texture of mud. Instead of cleaning guns, they were mixing paints to match the exact shade of olive drab needed to fool a German observer at 500 yards. Camp Forest, Tennessee, became the laboratory for this madness, and immediately there was a culture clash. Regular infantry units hated them. They looked at the 23rd and saw a bunch of artsy kids who got to play with balloons while they were preparing to die in the mud. They called them the Rubber Army. But the training was deadly serious, because the art had to survive the reality. Here was the problem. An inflatable tank looks like a tank until you touch it, or until the wind blows. During one early test, a gust of wind picked up a 40-ton Sherman tank and blew it across the parade ground like a beach ball. It bounced over the colonel's jeep. The illusion was fragile, so they had to become perfectionists. They learned that deception wasn't just about the object, it was about the trace. If a column of tanks moves through a field, they churn up the earth. Inflatable tanks leave no tracks. So the Ghost Army invented bulldozers to carve fake tracks into the ground. They realized that real soldiers aren't silent, so they recruited sound engineers from Bell Labs to record the sounds of war on massive wire recorders, the ancestors of the cassette tape. By the time they were ready to ship out to Europe, the 23rd had organized itself into 4 distinct arms of deception. This was their toolbox. First, the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the visual artists. These were the guys with the inflatables. Their job was to create the shell. They could inflate a battalion of tanks in 30 minutes using air compressors. Second, the 3132nd Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deceivers. These were the audio wizards. They mounted 500-pound speakers on half-tracks. They could project the sound of a moving armored column up to 15 miles away. They could make the forest sound like it was full of engines, swearing sergeants, and clanking metal when it was actually empty. Third, the radio company, the scriptwriters. Their job was to flood the airwaves. They mimicked the radio traffic of real units. They learned the fists, the unique tapping styles of real radio operators, so that German listening posts would think, "Ah, that's Sergeant Smith from the 6th Armored Division," when Sergeant Smith was actually 100 miles away. And fourth, the 406th Combat Engineers, the security, because if a German patrol got too close and poked a bayonet into a rubber tank, the game was over. They were the perimeter, the only thing standing between the artists and the SS. In May 1944, the Ghost Army packed their paints, their speakers, and their balloons, and boarded the troop transports headed for England. They were 1,100 men going up against the Wehrmacht. They had no heavy weapons. Their armor was made of air. If they were caught, Hitler had issued a standing order for commandos and spies, absolute execution, no prisoners. As the coast of America faded behind them, one young artist wrote in his diary, "We are going to Europe to paint. I just hope the Germans appreciate the exhibition." They were about to find out that in war, the price of a bad performance is death. You have the tanks, you have the sound, you have the radio, but the Ghost Army commanders knew that wasn't enough. A lie is like a tapestry. If you pull one loose thread, the whole thing unravels. If a German spy saw a tank with the wrong bumper marking, or heard a soldier wearing a 6th Armored Division patch talking about the wrong commander, the game would be up. So they didn't just build props, they built a universe. This is where the artistry truly took over. This was the special effects department, and their obsession with detail was bordering on insanity. When the Ghost Army moved into a sector to impersonate a specific division, say the famous 75th Infantry, they didn't just inflate balloons. They became the 75th. Before a mission, the artists would spend all night sewing counterfeit shoulder patches onto their uniforms. They created thousands of fake stencils. They would repaint the bumper markings on their jeeps and trucks to match the unit they were mimicking. But the visual disguise was just the surface. The real genius was in the atmosphere. They called it special effects, but it was really method acting on a massive scale. The soldiers were ordered to drive their trucks back and forth through local towns simply to create traffic. But they couldn't just drive, they had to look the part. If they were impersonating a unit that had just come from the front lines, they would muddy their uniforms, slump in their seats, and look exhausted. If they were impersonating a fresh unit, they would starch their shirts and salute crisply. Then came the gossip campaign. This was the most dangerous part of the illusion. The Ghost Army officers knew that French towns were crawling with German spies and collaborators. So they turned the soldiers into actors. Small groups of Ghost Army soldiers, wearing their fake patches, would go into local cafes and bars. They would order omelets and wine. They would get a little too loud. They would pretend to be drunk. And then they would accidentally let slip a piece of information. "Make a toast to Colonel Johnson," one might shout, naming the commander of the unit they were faking. Or they would complain about being moved to a specific location the next day. The spies in the corner would listen, write it down, and send it to Berlin. The Germans thought they were stealing secrets. In reality, they were swallowing poison. While the actors were working the bars, the scientists were working the woods. The sonic deception, the audio arm of the Ghost Army, was years ahead of its time. Remember, this was 1944. There were no MP3s, there were no cassette tapes. To record sound, they used wire recorders. It was a primitive technology that used a hair-thin steel wire moving at high speed to capture magnetic impulses. The fidelity was terrible, but it was loud. The audio engineers went to Fort Knox before shipping out. They recorded everything. They didn't just record tank noises. They recorded the specific squeak of a Sherman tank's tread. They recorded the heavy thrum of a half-track. They recorded the sound of men building a pontoon bridge, the hammering, the swearing, the splashing water. In the field, they played these sounds through 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks. They called them heaters. These speakers were so powerful they could be heard 15 miles away. But the genius wasn't in the volume, it was in the mixing. They could mix a battle live. If the weather was rainy, they adjusted the bass to sound like heavy vehicles slogging through mud. If it was a clear night, they made the sound crisp and sharp. They could make a column of tanks sound like it was moving from left to right, fading the sound from one speaker to the next, creating a stereo image of an army on the move for a German listening post across the river. And finally, to seal the illusion, there was the radio. This was the script writing. The Germans were masters of radio interception. They knew the fist, the unique tapping rhythm of every American radio operator. They knew that Bill from the 2nd Armored tapped his key heavily, while Jack from the 9th was faster. So the Ghost Army radio operators had to learn to mimic those fists. They were impressionists. They would sit in their trucks, tapping out messages that were pure fiction. They created entire phantom networks. They requested fuel drops that would never arrive. They reported engaging enemies that didn't exist. They complained about the weather. They filled the airwaves with the boring, mundane bureaucracy of an army, because nothing sounds more real than boredom. The result was a multimedia symphony of lies. A German commander looking at his map would see a tank column reported by his scout planes. He would hear the engines reported by his listening posts. He would intercept radio orders confirming the movement. And his spies in the local village would confirm that drunken American soldiers were talking about the attack. Everything told him the army was there. His eyes, his ears, and his intelligence reports all agreed. It was a perfect picture. The only thing missing was the truth. Training was over. The games in Tennessee were finished. In June 1944, the Ghost Army landed in France, just weeks after D-Day. The reality of war hit them the moment their boots touched the sand. It wasn't the glory they had seen in newsreels. It was the smell of wet ash, rotting livestock, and cordite. They drove their trucks past ruined villages and shattered churches. They saw the real bodies of American GIs lined up under ponchos. Suddenly, the art project didn't feel so clever anymore. Their first major test came outside the port city of Brest. The mission was simple but terrifying. The Ghost Army would set up a fake armored position on the left flank to draw German fire, allowing the real armored division to attack from the right. Think about that for a second. Their official order was to make themselves the most attractive target on the battlefield. They were literally human bait. They moved in at night, under the cover of darkness. This was the ghost doctrine. Arrive unseen, leave unseen. In the pitch black, 1,000 men worked frantically. Air compressors hummed, inflating rubber Sherman tanks. Speakers were positioned in the trees. Camouflage nets were draped over empty fields. By sunrise, the illusion was complete. To a German observer on the hill, it looked like a fortified American stronghold. But then, the physics of the inflatable world began to clash with reality. As the sun rose, the air inside the rubber tanks expanded in the heat. The valves hissed. Later, as the temperature cooled, the air contracted. One patrol reported a terrifying sight. The barrel of a 75mm cannon on a rubber Sherman began to droop. It slowly wilted like a dying flower until it was pointing sadly at the ground. A soldier had to sprint out into the open field, risking sniper fire, to re-inflate the gun barrel before the Germans noticed that American steel had suddenly gone soft. And then the shelling started. This was the moment the artists realized the true cost of their deception. When you trick the enemy into thinking you are a threat, they treat you like a threat.
88mm artillery opened up on their position. Der Ground shook. Dirt und Shrapnel spreite in die Air.
In a real tank unit, you have 40 tons of steel between you and the explosion. You can button up the hatch. You are safe. But in the Ghost Army, there was no steel. There was only rubber and canvas. A piece of shrapnel could tear through a fake tank, through the fake truck behind it, and into the men hiding in the foxhole. They huddled in the dirt, clutching their helmets, listening to the whistle of incoming rounds. They had no heavy guns to fire back. They couldn't reveal their position by shooting small arms. They just had to sit there and take it. They had to trust that their deception was working so well that the Germans were wasting valuable ammunition on balloons. Every explosion was a validation of their art, but every explosion was also a brush with death. During one operation, a French farmer stumbled onto their position. He watched in horror as 4 soldiers walked up to a Sherman tank, grabbed it by the fenders, and lifted the entire vehicle, spinning it around to face the other direction. The farmer stood there, mouth open, his bottle of wine slipping from his hand. To him, these Americans weren't just soldiers, they were supermen. The unit commanders had to rush over and detain him until the operation was over. The secret was that fragile. One talkative farmer, one drooping gun barrel, one popped seam, and the massacre would begin. They survived Brest. They survived the hedgerows. But as the Allied armies pushed toward the German border, the stakes got higher. The Ghost Army was no longer just a sideshow. They were about to be called up for the main event. A mission so dangerous and so massive that it would require every balloon, every speaker, and every ounce of courage they had left. By March 1945, the Allies had reached the final barrier of the Third Reich, the Rhine River. To end the war, they had to cross it. But the Germans were waiting on the other side, dug in with everything they had left. A direct assault was suicide. The U.S. Ninth Army needed a miracle. They needed the Germans to look the wrong way for just 24 hours. This was the moment the Ghost Army was built for. It was called Operation Viersen. It wasn't just a mission, it was their magnum opus. The plan was audacious. The Ghost Army would set up 10 miles south of the real crossing point. Their job was to impersonate not just a battalion, but 2 massive infantry divisions, over 30,000 men. They had to convince the German High Command that the main invasion was happening here, while the real army crossed there. They emptied the toy box. They deployed 600 inflatable tanks and trucks. They set up heavy artillery decoys that flashed but didn't fire. They activated every radio script they had written, flooding the airwaves with the chatter of a massive buildup. But the real genius was the sound. The Ninth Army was moving thousands of real tanks into position just a few miles away. The noise of their engines would have given the game away. So the Ghost Army used their sonic trucks to create a wall of sound. They blasted the noise of bridge building and tank movements so loudly that it masked the sound of the real army preparing for the kill. For 3 days, they put on the performance of a lifetime. Across the river, the German binoculars were watching. The German listening posts were recording. And they took the bait. On the morning of the attack, the German artillery unleashed hell. They fired barrage after barrage. They pounded the Ghost Army's position, determined to stop the invasion force they saw on their maps. While the earth exploded around the artists and the rubber tanks, 10 miles up the river, the water was calm. The real Ninth Army launched their boats. They crossed the Rhine with almost no resistance. They captured the far bank before the Germans even realized they had been fighting a phantom. Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower watched the operation unfold. It was a tactical masterpiece. Thousands of American lives were saved because the German army spent its fury on a field of balloons. The artists had burned the Reich, not with fire, but with imagination. They had proven that in the brutal arithmetic of war, a good lie is worth more than 1,000 guns. But as the smoke cleared and the war ended, the curtain fell, and it fell hard. The war ended. The ticker tape fell in New York City. Soldiers came home to parades, medals, and stories they would tell their grandchildren for decades. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, there was only silence. Before they were discharged, they were given one final order. It wasn't to paint a truck or record a sound. It was to forget. The Army classified the existence of the Ghost Army as top secret. The Pentagon believed that the deception techniques, the sonic trucks, the inflatables, the radio networks, were so advanced that they might be needed again against the Soviets in the Cold War. So the artists took an oath of silence. They went home to their wives and told them they had been clerks or mechanics, or that they just did what they were told. They locked the most exciting chapter of their lives in a mental box and threw away the key. They went back to their studios, and ironically, many of them became famous for revealing the truth through art while hiding a lie in their hearts. Bill Blass became a fashion icon, dressing first ladies and movie stars. Ellsworth Kelly revolutionized modern art with his bold colors and shapes. Arthur Singer painted the birds of the world. They were celebrated for their vision, But the world had no idea that their greatest masterpiece wasn't hanging in a gallery. It was rotting in a classified file in Washington, D.C. For 50 years, they carried the secret. They attended reunions, but they couldn't talk to the press. They watched war movies that got the history wrong, and they said nothing. It wasn't until 1996 that the Pentagon finally declassified the files. The ghost finally stepped out of the shadows. When the truth came out, military historians were stunned. They analyzed the data and realized the scale of the achievement. The Ghost Army had staged over 20 major battlefield deceptions. They estimated that this unit of 1,100 artists had saved the lives of between 15,000 and 30,000 American soldiers. 30,000 men who came home, got married, had children, and lived full lives simply because a painter stood in a field and tricked a Nazi tank commander into looking the wrong way. In 2024, the surviving members of the Ghost Army were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Most of them were gone, but a few remained. Old men in wheelchairs, wearing faded caps, receiving the applause they had earned 8 decades ago. They proved that war isn't just about who has the biggest gun. It's about who has the best story. They were the soldiers who didn't kill. They were the army that wasn't there. And in the end, they pulled off the ultimate trick. They disappeared into history, leaving nothing behind but the lives they saved. This was the story of the Ghost Army, the only unit in World War II that had the courage to fight with nothing but thin air.